Welcome, everyone. We've been talking a lot about God's Sabbaths the past few weeks. I know many of us did not grow up keeping the Sabbath. I know many of us had not considered the seventh-day Sabbath or actually any of God's Sabbaths until sometime later in our lives, when this knowledge was revealed to us. Now, some were taught or perhaps just assumed that Sunday, the first day of the week, is God's Sabbath day. But we saw last week that this isn't the case. In fact, most Christian denominations will affirm that the weekly Sabbath day has always been and always will be the seventh day of the week. It's just that man, claiming the authority to supersede God's authority, declared that we should make Sunday, the first day of the week, our day to assemble. But the point I really wanted to make, though, was that in the past, I know many of us considered Sunday to be our holy day for whatever reason. It was how many of us were just brought up. It became a way of life for us. And after keeping Sunday as our holy day for years, in many cases, many of us developed habits over time that were actually in opposition to God's true Sabbath days. We didn't know any better at the time. For example, if Sunday, the first day of the week, was our day of worship, then it made sense to do our shopping the day before. So I would say that Saturday would be a preparation day for those who observe Sunday, just as those who observe God's seventh-day Sabbath use Friday as their preparation day as instructed by our Bibles. We'll take a look at the preparation day shortly. When we learned about God's true Sabbath days, I'm sure that some, if not most of us, found it challenging to make the change to God's actual Sabbath day. We had so many habits, so many activities that needed to be changed if we were to observe God's true holy days. It may have seemed at first that this would be a burden. When I first began to observe the Sabbath, it did seem a little odd to me. Odd to keep a holy day that had always been, a work day to me in the past. On top of that, God's Sabbaths begin at sundown, not at midnight as I was used to. Well, as I got started in this, I decided for one thing that I would not spend the Sabbath mowing my yard. Now, often in the summertime, it gets really hot. And I would often mow on Fridays, very late in the afternoon when it began to cool down a bit. Of course, invariably, I would end up mowing with my mower's lights on, long after it got dark on Friday evening. So now here I am again mowing on a Friday, although I did begin earlier than I had in the past so I could try to finish before the Sabbath began at dark. But it was getting later than I'd planned. But I didn't want to be mowing when the Sabbath began. Each time I was turning to the west, the sun was getting in my eyes as it sank lower in the sky. So I'm really concerned now, and so how could I be sure that I wouldn't be working on the Sabbath day? Well, I had a program on my computer that gave the exact time of sunset for any day at my location. So I thought to myself, I could just stop the mower, run to the house, power up my computer, let it boot up, run that program, and determine the exact time the sun would set here. Then I could find a clock to see how much time I had left to complete my mowing. But of course, time was getting short, and by leaving the tractor to go into the house to determine how much time I had left, that would waste valuable time. What was I to do? Well, of course, some may know that we live on the top of a hill and can see for miles. There's no trees in our way. The horizon's very flat. Suddenly it hit me. When does the Sabbath begin? At sundown? Well, I didn't need a computer and a clock. I just needed to watch the sun as it lowered in the sky. That's all I needed to do. But I was new at this, and I was trying my very best to keep God's Sabbath day. I think God may have gotten a chuckle out of this. I do believe he has a sense of humor. But sometimes, especially when we're new at it, we don't always know exactly how to keep the Sabbath. Sometimes we do need to change our habits to prepare for the Sabbath. Now, as far as my mowing our yard, now I just plan to mow it when I know I won't be rushing to get it done right before the Sabbath. I don't plan to start mowing at 7:30 p.m. right before the Sabbath now. And if it gets that close to the beginning of the Sabbath, I'll just wait and mow after the Sabbath day. Before we get too far into this, I'd like to quickly review God's Sabbath day. So if you would, let's go ahead and turn back to Genesis 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the Bible. We've been there a few times lately, but Genesis 1, verse 1. Let's see if we can determine how the Sabbath should be observed. Let's start at the beginning. Again, that would be at Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, the rest of chapter 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth, and God created everything in 6 days. But let's go ahead and move over to the last verse of Genesis chapter 1. That would be Genesis 1, verse 31. That's the last verse before we hit verse 2. That's Genesis 1, verse 31. Genesis 1, verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Now the next verse, Genesis 2, verse 1. What was next after this creation? Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Now this was at the end of the 6th day. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So we're told here that God rested from all his work. Turn, if you would, to Isaiah chapter 40. That's Isaiah chapter 40. Look at verse 28. That's Isaiah 40, verse 28. So, reading this, was God completely worn out from all his creation? Was God tired? Was he weary? Did God actually need to take a break here? Again, Isaiah 40, verse 28. Have you not known? Have you not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, faints not, neither is weary? Well, faints, here's the Hebrew word, af, and it means to tire or faint. Weary is the Hebrew word yagal, meaning to be exhausted or to be weary. So God doesn't actually get tired, and God never becomes exhausted. But Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 does say that God rested, at least in the King James anyway. The word rested here is Shabbath, like Sabbath in the Hebrew. And according to Strong's, it means to repose, to cease, desist from exertion, to celebrate. And one of Strong's definitions here reads, to keep the Sabbath. God didn't stop at the end of the 6th day because he was tired. He stopped because he had finished his creation of the heavens and the earth. And this phase of God's plan for us was complete. God looked at his creation and he saw that it was good. Perhaps he celebrated it in a sense, as Strong's seems to suggest. How many of us, when we finished a major project, will stop, take a break, and look back on our project and hopefully say to ourselves, our project is complete and it's good. I know when I lived on a farm as a child, each year we came to the end of the growing season. The fields were harvested and much of our work was done for the year. We would always take a break and look back at what we'd accomplished. It made us happy to see what we'd done in that growing season. So we took a break from our hard labor. Of course, this didn't last very long. It would soon be time to engage in winter activities and get back to work. Still, you might say we celebrated our accomplishment, if only temporarily. On that 7th day, God looked back at his creation, his work. It was a special day to him, a very special day, and to us. And we know that a day is as 1,000 years to the Lord. Many believe that after 6,000 years of man battling the earth, other humans, and Satan, this will pretty much come to an end in the 7th day, or the 7,000-year period of man's existence, what we know and often call the millennium. During the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, the earth and mankind will get a rest, we might say, from what we had to deal with for the previous thousands of years of work. But God made the seventh day unlike the rest. God made the seventh day holy. He set apart the seventh day. As we said, God's Sabbath day was actually created for man. It was created for us. As Jesus said in Mark 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was created for our benefit, and it really should not be a burden. And if it is a burden to us, then we must be doing something wrong. I'll say to all those who are yet to keep God's Sabbaths, you don't know what you're missing. You really don't. It's a time when we rest, and as humans, we certainly can use the rest. Like God's first Sabbath, it's also a time for us to reflect on what God has done. Also, it's a time to reflect on what we have accomplished in the previous 6 days. Our daily study of Scripture has hopefully brought us better understanding during the week. But the Sabbath is when we have an entire day to learn and grow closer to God. Each Sabbath day, we have an appointment with God and our brethren. God made this appointment with us at creation. And this appointment has never been changed or canceled. In fact, the Sabbath is a sign between God and his people forever. Now, after speaking about the Sabbath the past few weeks, I've received several questions regarding exactly how we should observe the Sabbath. So today, I'm going to tell everyone exactly how we're to keep the Sabbath day holy. Are we ready? Well, I'd like to be able to tell everyone specifically exactly what to do and what not to do on God's holy Sabbath days, but I have two issues. Now, the first thing is we need to remember that our number one relationship is with God. We're all to follow Christ. We're to keep the commandments of God. I can try to provide some scriptures to guide us today. I can try to make suggestions and recommendations. And I might give examples of what I do or don't do on the Sabbath day, but ultimately, each of us have our own unique situations and our own relationship with God. We should always make decisions on how we live and how we observe God's Sabbath days based on prayer and careful study of his word, not just on what someone else says, including me. And the second thing I want to point out is that keeping the Sabbath might not be exactly the same for everyone. We're all different, a lot of different situations. Now, for example, on days like today when we stream our services live, many might call what we do work. Yeah, of course, we do prepare ahead of time, at least to some degree, but much remains to be done on the Sabbath day itself. It's unavoidable. For example, we have to bring the lighting up. We have 5 lights we use. We have to check those. We have to power up our camera and make sure its settings haven't changed. Once in a while they have. And also check that it hasn't accidentally gotten bumped out of position. That's happened before too. We need to make sure there's enough time on a recording media to record the entire service. The internet service needs to be verified. Now, fortunately, it's a rare occurrence, but our cable modem may occasionally need to be reset to ensure our speed is adequate to maintain our live stream. We check this right before we go on the air, you might say. The music and the hymns need to be rehearsed. And during this rehearsal, our audio levels need to be adjusted on our mixer. Now, you might assume that this could be done ahead of time, and basically we do. But we found that the volume of different songs varies somewhat. Even with attempts to get them to an average volume ahead of time, the levels still need to be checked and adjusted for each individual service. And then, of course, there are the humans that are involved. Now, some days people just project more when they speak or sing or play an instrument. It's just how we are. We vary day to day. So the audio levels need to be adjusted right before our service so that our sound is consistent and good. And when I'm speaking, I need all the help I can get. So we're careful to try to adjust that. We also need to temporarily turn off equipment such as our nearby heat pump to keep the noise down. And there are other things as well, like our cell phones. We actually have a checklist of 67 things we need to do immediately before and after each live service. And during the service, the equipment needs to be monitored and fine adjustments often need to be made on the fly. In fact, 2 minutes before we began the broadcast today, we had a warning light come on a piece of our equipment. Shouldn't affect us, but I'll deal with that after the Sabbath. Now, many of us would call this work, and I guess it probably is. Are we breaking or profaning the Sabbath day by working on this day? We'll get to that. But let's see what God has to say about keeping his Sabbath day in his Holy Bible. I notice there seem to be 2 or maybe 3 things that God expects us to do on the Sabbath day. Let's head over to Exodus 20, where we can find the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, verse 8. We were there again just recently. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. We'll be looking at the 4th of the 10 Commandments, of course, beginning in verse 8. So let's take a look at the first thing you might say we're commanded to do. Exodus 20, verse 8 tells us to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Of course, God didn't declare the Sabbath day here in Exodus. We saw earlier that God created the Sabbath at the time of creation. Here he's reminding the Israelites to keep the Sabbath. I suspect some had lost the habit, just as I think many have today. But if we're keeping the commandments of God, I believe the 4th and longest of the 10 Commandments certainly deserves our attention. Verse 9 tells us, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. And just as God did, we're to work the first 6 days of the week. Verse 10. But, here's the exception, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the Sabbath day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. We might place a bookmark here at verse 10. We'll be coming back to it a little bit later. But what does verse 10 tell us? Well, we're told that we're not to work on the Sabbath. We should refrain from our work. And not just us, but also our children and our servants as well, even our animals. So the first thing on my list that God expects of us is to refrain from work on the Sabbath day, to rest. Turn next to Leviticus 23, verse 3. That's Leviticus 23, verse 3. These should be familiar to us, if not from before, from the last few sermons we've had. Again, Leviticus 23, verse 3. And the second thing we're instructed to have on the Sabbath day is a sacred assembly. And that's what most of us recognize as going to church. Again, Leviticus 23, verse 3. Again, we see that 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Now, a holy convocation is a sacred assembly. Now, we talked about this before. That's when we get together. Some people talk about going to church, but we gather on the Sabbath day. We know that iron sharpens iron. And on God's Sabbaths, we're to come together, to learn from each other, to be inspired by each other's stories, to help us grow in love for Christ and each other. Okay, so those are 2 things. A third thing. What's the third thing that God expects us to do? Well, I believe that's found in Isaiah chapter 58. So if you would, let's take a look at Isaiah chapter 58. And we'll look at verse 13. So that's Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 13. So again, we see we're to rest on the Sabbath day and have a holy assembly. So what else does God tell us about keeping his Sabbath day? Well, actually, this is something God says that we should not do on the Sabbath. So again, Isaiah 58, verse 13. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then, this is an if then, if you do that, then shall you delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. Now, the Good News Bible puts it this way. I'll read that to you. verse 13. The Lord says, if you treat the Sabbath as sacred and do not pursue your own interest on that day, if you value my holy day and honor it by not traveling, working, or talking idly on that day, then you will find the joy that comes from serving me. I will make you honored over all the world, and you will enjoy the land I gave to your ancestor Jacob. I, the Lord, have spoken. In other words, our focus should be on God during the Sabbath day. We shouldn't plan activities that distract us from our focus on God. In other words, we shouldn't just do our own thing. Now, imagine, for example, we planned a big day at a NASCAR racetrack, maybe. We might get up early to travel to the track. We'd be focused on racing that day and driving to get there, probably. But our focus would not be on God and spiritual things. We likely wouldn't have time for a holy convocation that day. No, we're to devote the Sabbath day to spending time with God and our brethren. But remember the two greatest commandments. In Matthew 22, verse 37, Jesus told us, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like to it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So the Sabbath day gives us time to spend with God and each other, relatively free from the distractions of the world, and free from the work we would normally do that would keep us busy. The Sabbath day is a time when we can spend quality time with God and with each other. And for most of us in this day and age, time we would rarely have otherwise. So, how does God want us to observe His Sabbath day? Well, unlike God, we need physical rest. And probably more and more today, many of us need a mental break from our jobs just as much. So we're to refrain from work on the Sabbath. We're to rest. We're to assemble together, and we're to keep the focus on God on His Sabbath day. We're not to plan a big day out that isn't focused on God. And I think that most of us are aware that we are to rest on the Sabbath day and keep it holy or special. How that we're not to do our own thing on the Sabbath, things just for us, to focus our attention away from God. We shouldn't do that. So I think we have the basics, but I very often get questions about just exactly what we should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath. So I know we all know we're to rest and have a holy convocation. That part's easy to understand. But what should we not do on the Sabbath? Well, as I said, we should not work. Now, for example, I used to work in an office Monday through Friday. I was off on the Sabbath day. But sometimes in my line of work, as many of you may have the same situation, things simply must be done on the weekends. When that became necessary, I scheduled my time to avoid working on the Sabbath day. I was very successful at that. I worked hard at it, worked pretty well. But was there ever an emergency on the Sabbath day that needed my immediate attention? Well, the answer is yes. Actually, 3 times in 15 years that occurred. So what happens then? We'll get to that in just a bit. But it's not just our primary form of employment. We should not perform, say, routine maintenance on our vehicles or clean our gutters on the Sabbath day. These things should be done, of course, on the regular work days, the first 6 days of the week. These kinds of things are work for us, and of course, to some degree, would deprive us of the rest and spiritual nourishment and growth that the Sabbath day was intended for. Turn to Mark 15, verse 42, if you would. That's Mark 15, verse 42. Mark 15, verse 42. Now, in order that we can rest on the Sabbath and have time for God and the brethren, the day before the Sabbath day is the preparation day. And God instructs us to prepare the day before. We're to do the work needed to allow us the Sabbath as the day of rest and devotion that God intended. Here in verse 42, we find ourselves on the day before Sabbath. Now, in this case, it was a high Sabbath. In fact, it was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Just notice the preparation day is defined as the day preceding the Sabbath here in this verse. Let's just read this one verse, Mark 15, verse 42. And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So The day preceding any Sabbath day, either weekly or annual, is, of course, a preparation day. The preparation day is mentioned 6 times in the King James. I think the preparation day is a fairly obvious concept to us, but I wanted to look at the actual biblical definition. Let's get back to some of the specific questions on what we should and should not do on the Sabbath day. What about cooking on the Sabbath day? I get questions about that. Let's go ahead and turn over, if you would, to Exodus chapter 16. They're talking about cooking here, I believe. Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. Exodus chapter 16, verse 23. And this is right after the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. And I suspect they may have lost sight of the Sabbath and had to observe it during the time they were slaves of the Egyptians. But here in Exodus, I believe God, by way of Moses, was trying to get them back on track. Let me read this to you from the Bible in Basic English. And this is Exodus 16, verse 23. And he, Moses, said, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord." So we know what day this is, right? He's telling them. "What has to be cooked may be cooked, and what is over put on one side to be kept till the morning." So here in verse 23, Moses told the people to cook whatever they were going to cook the day before the Sabbath day. They were to do this, of course, on the preparation day. And what was left over, they were to eat the next day on the Sabbath. To prepare a large meal can take some time. And often those preparing large meals, well, think about Thanksgiving, for example. Many get up very early and work a large part of the day to prepare that meal. That's right, they work a large part of the day. This is definitely work. And that can leave them with little time to rest and honor God on the Sabbath. So am I saying we shouldn't prepare anything to eat on the Sabbath day? Well, no, not really. Let me explain. Back in the days of the Exodus, preparing meals could be quite a chore. We have to remember that there were no refrigerators, no microwaves in those days. There weren't even any electric or gas stoves back then. Back then, pretty much any cooking was work. Now think about this. They typically had to gather wood, start a fire, and cooking might take a while. Now, while they're cooking or boiling, the stove would have to be attended. They couldn't just go off and leave that. The temperature wouldn't stay the same. Firewood would need to be added periodically. They would have to constantly monitor the fire to ensure it got neither too hot nor not hot enough. I think they would spend a great amount of time just tending to that stove. I suspect that without modern refrigeration, even some of the food they prepared would need to be gathered, like the manna, or possibly even animals might need to be slaughtered right before they begin to cook. So looking at this all together, it likely took hours away from their Sabbath day, which of course is something we don't want to do. But contrast that with today. Today we have microwave ovens and conventional ovens that we can just set and forget. Today we can open our refrigerators and perhaps just make a sandwich or have a bowl of cold cereal on the Sabbath. That would just take a couple of minutes to do. We might take an item from the refrigerator or possibly even the freezer and place it in a modern oven, set the timer, and just wait for the bell to ring, reminding us that our food's ready. In the meantime, we're not doing anything, right? We might start a slow cooker before the Sabbath and serve its contents on the Sabbath day. But unlike the ancient Israelites, we can prepare food today in minutes, possibly even seconds. While it could take some time to actually bake something or even warm it in a microwave, the actual time or amount of work we need to perform is minimal, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes. So, can I tell everyone exactly what we can and cannot prepare to eat on the Sabbath day? So, can I set a time maybe and say, well, cook anything as long as you want, as long as it doesn't take over 2 minutes? Well, that may be something that the Jews or the Pharisees specifically may have done. I don't know. But I believe that's for each of us to decide. What I believe I can say is that anything we do to prepare to eat for the Sabbath days should not interfere. It should not take any significant time away from our Sabbath. Back to the ancient Israelites who lacked our efficient modern food preparation of today. The Israelites kept their leftovers from the preparation day and ate those on the Sabbath. And that's something we can do as well. Leftovers, especially with modern refrigeration. Verse 24. We're still there, and I'm still reading from the Bible in Basic English. So regarding the food the Israelites prepared on their preparation day, verse 24. And they kept it till the morning as Moses had said, and no smell came from it, and it had no worms. And Moses said, make your meal today of what you have, for this day is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not get any in the fields. Now here God was teaching his people not to spend time cooking on the Sabbath day. He didn't want them to get their food, their groceries you might say, on the Sabbath. They were to have already gathered their food for the Sabbath on the preparation day. Verse 26. Now here, as I said, God is teaching the Israelites to prepare the day before. Verse 26. For 6 days you will get it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. But still on the seventh day, some of the people went out to get it, and there was not any. Again, I believe God was teaching them here. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you go against my orders and my laws? See, because the Lord has given you the Sabbath, he gives you on the 6th day bread enough for 2 days. Let every man keep where he is. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people took their rest on the 7th day. So God told his people not to go out on the Sabbath day and look for manna. So I think the lesson here for us today is that we shouldn't wait to go to the grocery store and plan our meals on the Sabbath day. As much as possible, this should be done during the week ahead of time, possibly on the preparation day. In fact, buying, selling, and otherwise conducting business is also prohibited on the Sabbath. And it would probably be considered a work, I would think. Let's turn next to Nehemiah 10, verse 28. That's Nehemiah chapter 10 and verse 28. Nehemiah 10:28. Now the people here were turning back to serve God, something they had not been doing. I'll be reading from Nehemiah in the International Standard Version, by the way, but let's see what they're up to as they turn back to serve God. Nehemiah 10, verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the descendants of Levi, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and everyone who had separated themselves from the peoples of the surrounding lands for the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, and all who had knowledge and understanding, joined with their relatives and their leaders. They entered into an oath, enforced by a curse, according to the International Standard, to walk in God's law that was given through God's servant Moses, and to be careful to obey all of his commandments, all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, as well as his regulations and statutes. We will not give our daughters in marriage to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. Now, notice as we read in verse 31 that people brought things into Jerusalem for sale on the Sabbath. But see that the people refused to purchase any of it on the Sabbath day. They refused to buy or sell on the Sabbath. They would not conduct any business on the Sabbath day. Verse 31. As for the people of the land who bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. So we see that those in Nehemiah's day who made an oath to keep God's commandments did not buy or sell on the Sabbath. Turn next, if you would, to Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21 and verse 12. Matthew 21 and verse 12. Something else we've talked about not too long ago. The beginning of this chapter, this is where Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a colt. Remember that? 10th day of the month? What day of the week did he do this? What day of the week are we talking about here? Yeah, I believe we determined a while back that this was on a Sabbath day. We might call it Palm Sabbath, I suppose. But when Jesus, on that day, when Jesus went into the temple on that Sabbath day, what happened? Remember? Matthew 21, verse 12. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. Now it appears that Jesus was not happy with those buying and selling in the temple on the Sabbath day. When I first read that, I was shocked. Jesus? Physically overturning tables? Wow. Jesus suffered many things, but I don't ever recall him being this angry about anything else. He really didn't like that. At any rate, I'd say we should avoid buying and selling on the Sabbath if at all possible. We should refrain from doing any kind of business on the Sabbath day, unless it's something we just can't avoid. Now, one question I often get is, I know some of you are waiting for this, is it okay to dine out on the Sabbath day? Now, if we're not cooking a big meal at home, is it okay to go out for a nice meal at a restaurant on the Sabbath day? Well, that's a great question, and something many of us, unfortunately, are divided on. I know we're very divided on that topic. Let's take a look at both sides of this argument. In fact, I'd like to go back now to Exodus 20, verse 10. That's where I asked you to hopefully held a bookmark there from earlier. Exodus 20, verse 10. And believe it or not, I intend to use this one scripture to argue both sides of the issue. There's more to come, but anyway, Exodus 20, verse 10. Let's see what it says. We read this before. Let's pay attention to it this time, though, closely. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. Well, I don't think it can be more plain, as long as we decide what work is anyway, but starting again. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. In it you shall not do any work. But there's more. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. The cessation of work on the Sabbath is not just for us. We're not to have our sons or daughters or servants, even our animals, to work on the Sabbath. We're to see that all of us are to do no work on the Sabbath day as best we can. Now, I'd assume that if we leave our homes and go to a restaurant to get something to eat, the following things come into play. At least it's sort of always assumed. The first thing is, it appears we're definitely making a purchase on the Sabbath day. I know most restaurants aren't free. If you know of any, let us know. Wouldn't that be conducting business on the Sabbath day when we pay for our meal? And we just read in Exodus 20, verse 10, that our servants are to rest on the Sabbath day. So the next question might be, if we contract with someone to prepare and serve us a meal, are they not our servants, at least temporarily? I think it's a good question. Would this violate the commandment for us not to have servants do work for us on the Sabbath day? An arguable point is that Moses told the Israelites not to even leave their homes to get the manna. So is it okay to leave our homes to go to a restaurant on the Sabbath? And one more question might be, if we go to a restaurant to eat on the Sabbath, does our focus remain fixed steadfastly on God as we enter the world, as our thoughts might be drawn to more worldly things, like the people around us? Things that might distract us from our focus on God on His Sabbath day? I'd always assumed that eating out on the Sabbath would violate God's commandments, since we're conducting a big business transaction. We're purchasing a meal. And why do many of us tip our waiter or waitress? Well, I think we'd be paying directly for our service to them. That's the way I would think. Okay, I said I would use Exodus 20, verse 10 to argue both sides of the debate. So here goes. Well, Exodus 20, verse 10 does tell us not to have servants work on the Sabbath day, our servants anyway. Let's read the end of the verse here. Let's just skip down toward the end. I won't read the whole thing again, but it does say at the end that you're not to have your manservant, your maidservant, cattle, stranger that is within your gates doing work, okay? So that phrase, within your gates. I knew a minister once who taught that it's fine to dine out on the Sabbath day. And being aware of what I just shared, what I was thinking, I asked him for his reasoning. His claim is that we only control what is within our gates. That the servant, if you want to call it that we hire outside our typical household is not within our gates. Therefore, the rest of Exodus 20, verse 10 does not apply in this situation. Now, that's what I was told. Also, many claim that our servers at a restaurant are employees of the restaurant and their servants and not ours. And that they were going to be there anyway, regardless of whether you stopped by or not. Some suggest that if we say it's wrong to eat out on the Sabbath, then we should be shutting off our electricity and water on the Sabbath, since there's some that work on the Sabbath to provide us these things. And some point to the fact that David ate the showbread in the temple, but was blameless. Now, over the years, I've asked several people what their position is about dining out on the Sabbath. Now, can you guess what is by far the number one reason, or number one answer I get about their position? How do they determine their position? Well, anyway, the answer I most often get as to why they do what they do, whether they do or they don't eat out on the Sabbath, is they say, I follow whatever my church teaches. Whatever they say is what I do. But whatever we believe, whatever we do, it should never just be based solely on what our churches teach or what somebody tells us. It should be by what we've become convicted to do, based on our sincere and earnest prayers to God and the careful study of His holy word. So please, never base your beliefs and convictions on anything anyone, including me, ever says until we've proven it to ourselves. Remember, prove all things. So at this point, you may be wondering what my position on this is. I understand that people disagree on whether it is wrong to eat out on the Sabbath day or not, to pay someone to cook our food and serve it to us on the Sabbath day. But that decision, of course, is between us and God. Now, having said that, I do my best to accommodate everyone. We might notice that at the Feast of Tabernacles, we try to make food available to those who do not want to go out on the Sabbath day. Those that do choose to eat out on the Sabbath day, of course, may do so. But we don't schedule a group meal out on the Sabbath, since that obviously might exclude some of us. We want to be together as much as we can on the Sabbath. That's part of what we're doing there for the Sabbath day. Now, for our family, here's how we handle it. We basically follow the example we just saw in Nehemiah. We always have enough food in the house before the Sabbath day. Now, if we're low on food, we're sure to pick some up, whatever we might need on the preparation day, if not before. On the Sabbath day, either the food is prepared the day before, or we might have something like sandwiches and potato chips. Potato chips, yeah. Something simple and fast. It takes no time at all to do this. This is not going to interfere with our Sabbath at all. And we might even turn on the oven to make a pre-made pizza. But then it just takes a minute or two to pop in the oven, and later, when the beeping stops, we go pull it out and eat it. Now, technically, this is baking. It certainly is. But it's nothing like the way baking was done when it was a labor and time-intensive job in the past, like with the Israelites. We don't have to get the wood together and all that. Actually, salads and fresh fruit can be prepared ahead of time and require no cooking. And they'd probably be healthier for us anyway. But it usually takes us much less time to prepare our meal on the Sabbath day than it does to actually eat it. In this way, we can have more time to spend in study or in fellowship with the brethren. This helps make for a quiet and restful Sabbath for us and gives us more time for spiritual things. And we don't usually leave the house unless it's to go to a holy convocation where we can be with brethren. So, Alan, are you saying we should never, ever eat out on the Sabbath day? No, I'm not really saying that. There have been times when this might have been the thing to do. I mean, suppose you're on a trip and you just run out of food on the Sabbath day. Well, perhaps we could have planned better, but would we let our children go hungry? I hope not. We have to remember that when David ate the showbread, he actually broke God's law, just like we would be doing. But turn to Matthew 12, verse 1, if you would. That's Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. And we know what we're supposed to do on the Sabbath day, but we'll find if we're careful about it, there can be exceptions to what we might do on the Sabbath day. There are some commandments that might supersede God's Sabbath day instructions. Let's take a look at this in Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Now, here Jesus and his disciples were hungry. They were plucking corn from the field to eat. And the Pharisees were on top of that. They were quick to point out their error. So again, Matthew 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day, so it's a Sabbath day, through the corn. And his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Behold, Your disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. So how did Jesus answer the Pharisees? Verse 3. But he, Jesus, said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests? Now, when the fresh showbread was placed in the temple, the old bread was removed and given to the priests. It was strictly for the priests and their families. But David told Ahimelech, the priest, that he was on business as ordered by the king. David was hungry, and there was no other bread available except the showbread that was designated for the priests. So apparently God made an exception for David when he ate that showbread. Verse 5. He goes on to say, or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? As I mentioned earlier today, what I do on the Sabbath is to share the Word of God, and that's work. On the Sabbath days that are Feast of Tabernacles, it's really work. It's very rewarding, but it's still work. We love doing it, but it is work. So technically, I am profaning the Sabbath right now as I'm working to get today's message into all the world. But I'm counting on, like the priest that served on the Sabbath days, that I will be held blameless for my service to God as well. But there are exceptions to working and doing things on the Sabbath day. Right down to verse 9. That'll be Matthew 12, verse 9. Verse 9. Here the Pharisees, I think, were asking Jesus about healing a man with a withered hand. Let's see how Jesus answers them. And when he was departed thence, he went into the synagogue. Behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. And he, Jesus, said to them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. I think you've all heard about the ox in the ditch. I'll read that to you in Luke 14, verse 5. Jesus answered them and said, which of you shall have a donkey or an ox fall into a pit, it will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? We'll find there probably will be times when we need to deal with an unavoidable problem on the Sabbath day, and there will be some exceptions to it, the Sabbath. So we need to keep it in mind. One last question I received: should I go to a funeral on the Sabbath day? Well, there's biblical precedent for attending funerals. In fact, let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 2. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 2. Now, while you're turning there, I'd like to read from 2 Samuel 3, verse 31 in the easy-to-read version. And this is about David. It talks about David and the people all attending Abner's funeral. Let's take a look at that. I'll read it to you while you're turning over there. David said to Joab and to all the people with Joab, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth. Cry for Abner. They buried Abner in Hebron. David went to the funeral. King David and all the people cried at Abner's grave. So it appears that David and presumably all the people went to Abner's funeral. Well, let's take a look at Ecclesiastes 7, verse 2. I found that interesting. It says, reading from the Contemporary English Version, it is better to go to a funeral than to attend a feast. Funerals remind us that we all must die. It's better to go to a funeral than to attend a feast. So I see that going to a funeral is certainly not a problem. When we attend a funeral, it's really not for the deceased. They're asleep, right? They know not anything, at least not for now. But we can be there to support and comfort the family and friends at their time of grief. Is this an important thing to do? Does this show love to our neighbor or a relative or our friends? Well, personally, I would think so. How much more important is a man or a woman than a sheep or an ox? Whether someone has a withered hand or some other physical ailment, or maybe they're suffering emotional pain, maybe from a death in the family, I believe it's good to be there for them and help them if we can. There have actually been times when I was able to comfort those, at least a little perhaps, that at a funeral believed their loved one had gone to that hell of fire and brimstone. I was able to explain to them that this is not true and able to offer at least some hope. And obviously we can't attend every funeral, but when we feel like we should, I believe we probably should attend the funeral, at least the visitation perhaps. But the actual question was, should I attend a funeral on a Sabbath day? Well, if our reason is to be there for the family and to show them our love, to give them our support, to comfort them, just to be there for them. Personally, I believe this is a kind of doing good or doing well on the Sabbath that Jesus was talking about. But I also believe this is a very personal decision. As always, we might pray about each separate situation. Now, there is a scripture that might be confusing regarding this. Let's go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 8, if you would. That's Matthew chapter 8, verse 19. Now here we see a scribe approach Jesus and offer to follow Christ wherever he went. Again, that's Matthew 8, verse 19. There's a parallel passage in Luke as well, and I'll quote that to you in a minute. But let's take a look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 19. And a certain scribe came and said to him, Master, I will follow you wheresoever you go. And Jesus said to him, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has not where to lay his head. And another of his disciples said to him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. This man's asking to go bury his father. Verse 22. But Jesus said to him, Follow me, and let the dead bury the dead. Now this can also be found, by the way, in Luke chapter 9, verse 60, where Jesus said to him, Let the dead bury the dead, but go you and preach the kingdom of God. Now, obviously, the physically dead can bury no one. Now, most here believe that Jesus is saying to let the spiritually dead, in other words, those who are not followers of Jesus Christ, let them bury the physically dead. But was Jesus in so much of a hurry that he wasn't going to allow this man to bury his dead father? That's a good question. Well, many believe that this man's father was not dead. They suspect that this man wanted to wait until his father died, but that could have been days, weeks, or years. We don't know. Others suggest that this man was actually wanting to collect his inheritance before he left to follow Jesus. He just hang around till he got the inheritance, then he would go. That's what reminded me of that rich lawyer that refused to give up his riches to follow Christ. You probably remember that. And these could also have been very specific commands to specific people. People perhaps like that rich lawyer who were not truly willing to pull up their stakes and follow Christ. Their hearts weren't in it 100%. And there may be something to do with that. At any rate, I personally don't see this as telling us that we should never go to a funeral on the Sabbath day or any other day. I believe we should each do what we feel convicted to do. Yes, God comes first. But as we saw earlier, sometimes there are situations where we do need to do good or do well for our brothers and sisters, even on the Sabbath day. We shouldn't forget the second greatest commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves. To conclude today, God blessed and hallowed the seventh day of the week. The Sabbath day was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath day is a blessing to us if we allow it to be so, if we observe it as God intended, as God has commanded us to do. How are we to observe God's Sabbath day? Well, God tells us not to work on the Sabbath, but rather to rest from our labors. He tells us not to do our own pleasure on the Sabbath, but rather we're to spend that time with Him and each other. This is a day for a sacred assembly. But today we talked about some specific questions people have about observing the Sabbath day. I often get questions about what is considered work on the Sabbath day, exactly what we should and shouldn't do. So let me try to see if I can sum this all up very quickly. Answer all these questions at once. At least I'm going to try. So my answer to all the questions goes like this. I believe we're to prepare ahead of time for the Sabbath day. You do our very best to have all our chores and regular work finished by the end of the preparation day, and not push the issue like I used to do, but actually be ready, okay? Having said that, I know that there are people who, for example, have animals in their care, perhaps farm animals. They might require them to be fed, might require the people to feed them every day, including the Sabbath. So that still has to go on, but I believe we should prepare for the Sabbath by doing everything we can ahead of time. The Sabbath day should be free from work and distractions as much as possible so that we can keep our appointment with God and each other. But always remember that the second of the two greatest commandments, well, I'll try that again. The two greatest commandments are to love God and each other. Right. If we need to serve God in some way or help out in some kind of emergency situation, we can, and I believe we probably should, or we should, make the occasion an exception. I think we just need to ask ourselves the one simple question. Have we truly planned to have a distraction-free Sabbath where we can spend time without distraction with God and the brethren? Have we really done our best to prepare to keep God's Sabbath a day of rest? Will we keep God's Sabbath days holy and concentrate on Him and the brethren on the Sabbath rather than just doing our own pleasure? If so, I'd say we're keeping the Sabbath correctly. Even if at times we have to violate it, you might say, or break the Sabbath, if we have to have someone else that needs us that bad. We're to love our brethren too. Again, a judgment call. I'd like to close today with Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. We've seen that before today, but I'd like to close with those verses. You can turn there if you like. It's Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. The Sabbath day is a gift from God. Let's receive this great gift with great thanksgiving. Let's allow the Sabbath to bless us as it was intended by keeping it as God has directed. After all, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Again, Isaiah 58, verse 13 to end today. I'll be reading this in the International Standard Version. And here's what it says. If you keep your feet from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interest on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own ways and seeking your own pleasure or speaking merely idle words, then you will take delight in the Lord. He will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. He will make you feast on the inheritance of your ancestor Jacob, your father. Yes, the mouth of the Lord has spoken.